Thank you. എല്ലാവർക്കും നമസ്കാരം. പ്രൊഫസർ സ്കാരിയ സക്കറിയ എൻ്റെ സുഹൃത്തായിരുന്നു. ഞാൻ അദ്ദേഹത്തെ ആദ്യമായി കണ്ടത് ഇന്ത്യയിലെ വെച്ചാണ്. പിന്നീട് ഇസ്രായേൽ അദ്ദേഹം വന്നപ്പോൾ ഞങ്ങളുടെ സുഹൃദാന്തം കൂടുതൽ ശക്തമായി. കേരളത്തിൽ വരുമ്പോഴെല്ലാം ഞാൻ അദ്ദേഹത്തെ കാണാറുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. അദ്ദേഹം പല വിജ്ഞാന സംസ്കാരിക മേഖലകളിലും നിപുണനായിരുന്നു. അതുമാത്രമല്ല, അതിരുകളില്ലാത്ത ഒരു വലിയ വൈജ്ഞാനിക സമ്പത്തിനുടമയായിരുന്നു അദ്ദേഹം. പ്രൊഫസർ സ്കാരിയയെ കാണാനും പരിചയപ്പെടുവാനും അടുത്ത് അറിയുവാനും സാധിച്ചത് എൻ്റെ ഭാഗ്യമായി ഞാൻ കരുതുന്നു. I'm going to be giving this lecture in English. I apologize for that. Perhaps in 2 or 3 years, if you invite me again to this college, perhaps I'll speak to you in Malayalam. But for now, you'll have to put up with my English. You'll have the texts that I'll be talking about on the screen in Malayalam Lipi and also in transliteration and in my translation. And I want to say, first of all, that I'm very grateful and truly moved and honored to have been asked to give this first Scaria Zacharia memorial lecture. Thank you for this. So I'll be talking today about Punam Nambudri and the Bhasha Ramayana Champu. These days, the Bhasha Ramayana Champu is always open on my desk. And I read the verses over and over again because they merit that attention. One has to read them many times. And I'm a slow reader. Anyway, I'm a slow reader, always. The trigger to this interest in Punam has to do with the fact that Dr. Sudha Gopalakrishnan and I are doing a complete translation of the Bhasha Ramayana Champu for the Murti Library of Classical India. That's a big job because there are some 2,000 padyams in Punam and another 200 or 300 Gadyam passages, some of them very long and rather difficult. And we manage on Zoom, usually, if we're lucky, we might do, say, 10 verses in a week, a draft of 10 verses in a week. So you can do the calculation. You can see that it will take us some years. Maybe 4 or 5 years, an optimistic prognosis to complete this work. And I'm new to Punam. I'm learning as we go along, although I've read some of the Bhasha Ramayana Champu before. But what I have to say to you today is still kind of early, exploratory, experimental ideas. Always in the back of my mind, when I am reading Punam, I have the texts that seem somehow to be comparable to it, or even related to it, like the Tamil Kamba Ramayanam, for example. Or like the Ramayana Prabandham, the Sanskrit collection from Kerala, which is an anthology used by the Chakyars. Although I must say the real parallel, the closest parallel to Punam, in my experience, is not a Ramayana text at all, but it is Nannaya's Telugu Mahabharatam from the 11th century, because Punam, like Nannaya, he fashioned the, let's call it the paradigm or the template for how to compose a major poetic work stylistically, syntactically, metrically, and other linguistic features as well, including the particular combination of Sanskrit and Telugu, in this case, Sanskrit and Malayalam. Like Nanaya, Poonam produced that template for, really one could say, for all of the subsequent Manipravalam and Malayalam Champu literature, including some of the subversive reactions to that literature, like, for example, Kunjan Nambiyar. So that's in the back of my mind. I'm not going to say anything today about the text-critical issues. They're very interesting, but we don't have time. I want to read some poems with you, and I assume that everyone here will know the story. Actually, it's a modern story about the Padinettara Kavigal, the 18 and a half poets at the Zamarin's court. V.V. Haridas has shown us that this is a modern story, relatively modern. But it's a beautiful story because it talks about 18 Sanskrit poets at the Zamarin court, and then half a poet, and that is the poet Poonam, because he was writing in Malayalam and not in Sanskrit, supposedly. But actually, I agree with Ullur, who says that Arakavi is really a poet and a half, because that final poet, like in any numerical series in India, it's the final element which somehow comprises, subsumes, completes, and maybe transcends the series as a whole. So in that sense, Poonam, I think of him as a poet and a half, like Ullur. So I'm going to be talking mainly about two things, two aspects of the poetic work of Poonam. If there were time, maybe I'd have a third feature. I don't think there'll be time. First, I want to begin by talking about the tone or the tonality that we find in Poonam's verses. In Malayalam, people say that Poonam, that he's famous for his palitam, which means his wit or wittiness, and it's usually a kind of sharp and pungent wit. And sometimes, quite often, it might have an ironic tinge to it, a kind of irony. So I want to talk a little bit about that. We'll begin with that. And afterwards, I'm going to be speaking about the citation versus quotations in Poonam. We'll come to that in a few minutes. I'm not going to be speaking in a kind of abstract way. We'll be reading some verses together. I'll have a few things to say about the verses, I mentioned the word irony. I have to say I'm not at all sure that irony is a universal category or a useful category. I don't know. The words we have for irony in the South Indian languages are usually not very helpful. In Malayalam, sometimes people say irony is virodhabhasha, but actually that's a mistake. It's not at all like virodhabhasha. It's not meant to be like that. There is a word in Tamil, an old word from the Chola period, muran or muranbade. That's irony. Muran means something that is at variance, or maybe a little disjunctive, or even one might say a little rough and asymmetrical. That's all muranbade. That could be something, a good term for irony, and it's used that way in the Tamil erudite literature, but anyway, we'll have to do without a term, and you'll just assume, I hope, with me, allow me to use the word ironic, and let us see what happens. I want to give you some examples of verses that I think have an ironic flavor in Poonam, and that irony is somehow part of that pungent wit, palitam, for which Poonam is famous. Let's begin with this verse you have on the screen. This is definitely an ironic verse. It's from the Vichinabhishekam. All the translations, by the way, are done together with Sudha Gopalakrishna. So I'll read the verse and then the English translation and say something about it. Here we have Rama talking to his brother Lakshmana after Dasharatha has said what he had to say, that he's going to give the crown to Bharata, and Rama has to go to the forest. Right? So Lakshmana, is very angry at this. He wants to destroy the whole world and kill the king and all of that. So very angry. Rama's not angry. And this is what he says. Kashtam tatagniye kal idibata valudoham takantaravasam drishtva sevichikolam avire banditcha vrindam muninam otte nyan indutane mama pitrvachanam bhudarai ramburashao Pettena abhajyasetum televinodana dattiruvan nirvishankam. And if we had time, I would read the poem to you another 2 or 3 times, just for you to hear it and take it in. It's really important to do it like that, but here it is in some kind of English. Rama says to Lakshmana, do you really think living in the wilderness is a bigger thing than obeying our father's command? I'll be more than glad to wander here and there, paying honor to the sages. What's more, here I am today, fully aware, ready to hurl mountains into the ocean to build a bridge at a moment's notice, if my father wants it. Have no doubt. So the beauty of this verse, is that everybody who hears it, everybody anywhere, any Malayalam speaker, anybody in Kerala who hears this verse knows that Rama is going to build that bridge. A day will come when mountains are going to be thrown into the ocean, and he'll build the Setu to Sri Lanka, right, to Lanka. And that's what's called, usually in the West, it's usually called dramatic irony, although I would prefer to call it epistemic irony. It exists when the audience, the listeners or the readers, know something that the character doesn't know, or the characters do not know. And that gives an ironic flavor to the verse. And actually, it's kind of amazing if you think about it. What is he saying? My father were to ask me, he says it in a kind of subjunctive mode. If he were to ask me, then I would do that. But everybody knows he's going to have to do that. Right? That's epistemic irony. It's a very simple kind of irony. There are more interesting kinds. But here's an example, at least, that we can be pretty sure it's the category of a kind of irony. Now, let's go to the next verse, please. Okay, good. So now, Rama, before he leaves, he goes to see Kaikeyi and to say goodbye. And they have a kind of conversation. And here's Rama. Just after he's got the news, he's talking to Kaikeyi, and he says like this. This is a verse taken from the Bhoja Champu. That is, Punam didn't write it, he took it and put it into his text. Out of the 2,000 verses of the Punam text, about 600, almost a third of the text, are citations or quotations from other works, Sanskrit works. Very few of them from the Valmiki Ramayana, by the way, and there are nearly all of them from other later texts. But as you'll hear in a moment, and I'll try to explain to you, the moment a verse like that is taken from some other text, like the Bhoja Champu here, in my opinion, it's become Punam's verse. This is Punam speaking through the voice of the author of the Bhoja Champu. So here is what Rama says to Kaikeyi. Vanapuvitana matra tranamagnapitam me sakala bhuvana bhara stapito vatsamudhni tadiha sukaratayam avayostalkitayam mai patati gariyanam bate pakshapataha. That's how we sing Malini in Jerusalem. It's the West Indian way of singing Malini. He says, Mother, he calls her Mother. Mother, my only task in the forest is looking after my body. Tanumatra tranam. But the burden of protecting the whole world now rests on the head of your son, Bharata. Just think about it. Which is better? Clearly, I'm the one you love more. So here's an interesting question to you. If you listen to this verse, you can make up your own mind whether Rama is speaking completely sincerely. I mean, if you adopt the idealistic view of Rama as a kind of always perfect, noble paradigm of a human being, then maybe he actually means what he says, but you can't help but, as you read that verse, you wonder if he really means it. That's the other possibility. Maybe he's saying it with some ambivalence. Who knows? That's a kind of irony. The mere possibility that it exists like that is a kind of irony, and the quotation, because it's a quotation, amplifies what is going on in the character, the hero's mind, or amplifies, you could say, the pregnant nature of the situation. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. Okay, let's do another verse. These are all pretty simple examples. Let's go to the next verse, please. So here, now we're still in the Vichinabhisheka. Sita is there. Sita wants to come with Rama to the forest, right? He's not so sure that she should come with him. Actually, he tries to discourage her. There are some Ramayanas, Adhyatma Ramayana, for example, where Sita says to Rama, after he says, please don't come, stay here, I'll be back, it's only 14 years, I'll be back soon. Sometimes he says that to her, and Sita says, have you ever read a Ramayana or heard a Ramayana where Sita does not go to the forest? That's an argument that there's no answer to that argument. So, but in the Punam text, there's a verse taken this time from the Hanumanadakam. It's a beautiful verse. It goes like this. Adav eva krishodari kuchitati bharena namra punaha keli chankramanam nachanaiva sahase dola vidhautam yasi srota kanana gauta nilcharagiri prayana puvaniman Pubhagan ay bhiru bhairavamrigan vaidehi yayah katam. He says, first things first. Your waist is razor thin, and you can barely stand under the burden of your breasts. Even when you're playing, you can't risk running, and just swaying on a swing exhausts you. Kola vidhau tam yasi. You're easily spooked, piru. So how, my dear, can you go off to the wilderness with its rivers, thickets, caves, waterfalls, and mountains, not to mention wild beasts like you've never seen? Okay, this verse, the logic of this verse, is what we call the a fortiori argument. If you can't do X, how could you do Y? That's an a fortiori argument, which in Sanskrit is called the Danda Pupa Nyaya. Danda Pupa Nyaya means, suppose you have a danda, some stick. At the end of the stick, towards the end of the stick, there's an pupa, a cake, a kind of sweet. So a mouse, if it eats the stick, will it not eat the cake? It'll eat the cake, right? That's the a fortiori argument. That's what we have here. If you can't even swing on the swing without being exhausted, how are you going to walk to the forest with its fierce animals and the whole thing that he says, the mountains, the forest, the waterfalls and all that? How can you do that? There's a French philosopher whose name maybe some of you will have heard, and if not, you should know the name. His name is Vladimir Yankelevich, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. Yankelevich has a book about irony. He says the dominant logical mode of irony is this danda pupa nyaya. He calls it the a fortiori argument. You have to listen to the very gentle, charming way the verse is stated, and the argument is a witty argument, palitam. This is the palitam. it too carries a kind of ironic coloring or tinge. And this verse, of course, as you can see, well, I told you already, this is from the Hanumanataka. So we're in the same context of the earlier two verses. I want you to compare this verse, the gentle way he speaks, gentle but maybe slightly mocking way that he's speaking to Sita. Compare it to the way Rama speaks to Shurpanakha in the Kharavada. So you all know when Shurpanakha, they're in the forest, Shurpanakha, she wants Rama, and Rama toys with her with words in a rather cruel way. And he says all kinds of things, and then Lakshmana follows suit, does the same. All right, so let's look at one of Poonam's verses in which Rama is speaking to Shurpanakha. This is after the conversation has been going on for some time. He says to her, she's constantly pushing him. He says, Inakshima ulimale tabatalir ulime kanga kondin tane Vennunnu pani padma grahanam adinakan antarayo gariyan Nunam ninode kude Kaligalil vilayadiduvan takkadippol kanune nalla Keli manira vasatir mamaki paunashala. He says to Shurpanakha, such a beautiful lady, it's totally you, seeing your luscious body, I am dying to marry you right away. You'll notice that Rama is not speaking the truth. I'm dying to marry you right away, but see, we have a non-trivial problem. I can't find a bridal suite good enough for us. My home is a mere hut of weeds or reeds, Parnashala. This is an ironic verse. He doesn't mean what he's saying. It's a deeply ironic verse. And there's an interesting element here because when he says, Kanunen alakeli maniyara vasatir mamaki parnashala, he's doing something unusual with the word parnashala. My house, it's a mere hut of reeds. You know, the parnashala is actually a proper name. That's the name of the house, like people give names to their houses in Kerala. The name of the house in the forest is the Parnashala. Everybody knows. Actually, that Parnashala is a beautiful Keli Maniyara Vasati. That's really what it is. The happiest years in the life of Rama and Sita are there in that Parnashala. It has a kind of romantic, even erotic feel about it. So, when Rama says this to Shurpanakha, he's taking the very literal meaning of that name, Parnashala, reducing the overtones and the associations of that name, and using it in a highly literal, over-literalized way, which is in fact the heart of the irony. That's what in Sanskrit is sometimes called Lakshana Mula Dwani. That is, you don't actually mean what the words say. So that's a beautiful touch. It's a slight, clever touch. Palitam. He's re-semanticized the whole statement. So that's one thing. Now let's look at another verse of the same section when he says, he's still talking to Shurpanakha, and he says, Tashtya parayunadum lalita veni. Hope you can hear me with the rain going outside. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Darshtya malla parayunadum lalita veni kel idi kulicha nyan vekta penival pekshallagati nammeyum kimapi kaivida goshtiyam iruvar kurum agil itaretara madavar chattukam nittupotarunar mulam yendadai me samagamana sangadam. he says, this verse has a different tone a little. He says, "Lovely lady, don't think I'm making excuses. Listen, I can't desert this woman whom I married by right. And anyway, she won't leave me. Two women at home will be clobbering one another with ladles. Chatukam. Chatukam nituvor. That is my main worry." So that's the Malayalam proverb. You know this. If you have co-wives, Chatukam nituvar, right? And you should notice that this verse is a little different than the previous one because it's more familiar, more intimate. It's a little less Sanskritized. It's as if a kind of intimacy has been established with Shurpanakha. Still, he's speaking in a very kind of brutal way to her, and not speaking the truth. And the way he juggles these different registers and tones, that's a hallmark of Poonam's art. And if we had more time to stick with the Shurpanakha Lalita section and to look at the Gadya, you would see that it's a masterpiece of verbal excess, often bordering on the ridiculous. And here the poet speaks in his own voice, but I won't go into that today. Okay. I want to move on to the next topic. We've spoken a bit about the tone and the tonality and the thought that there's an ironic, clever, subtle, precise tone that maybe distinguishes Poonam from other poets. But now we have to address the question of these stolen verses, the verses that are quoted from other texts and put into the flow of the Poonam text. How are we meant to understand this? It's very easy for us, in fact, it's too easy for us to say, well, this was a poem, Poonam Nipasha Ramayana Chambu, this was meant to be recited by in some kind of kuti performance, maybe by the Chakyars. And so they threw in whatever was in their minds. They just took a verse from here or there, it kind of extended the passage, and the Chakyars like to do that kind of thing anyway. That's too easy an explanation, and it misses the point in a way. As I said to you earlier, the moment that a verse taken from somewhere else appears in the Poonam text, it's a Poonam verse. And there's a kind of rule of interpretation that I want to suggest to you, and that's one that we know. The rule is that a poem that is cited or quoted from another text and embedded in a new text never means what it did in the original. It's changed from the original place. It takes on a new, maybe more active and expressive life. The person who formulated this principle is the Argentinian writer Borges, whom you may know. Borges. He has a beautiful story. Some of you know the story of Pierre Menard, the author of Don Quixote, no? So just very briefly, I can tell you, this is a story about a 20th century, early 20th century man writing in Spanish. His name is Pierre Menard. His ambition was to write the Don Quixote that was produced in the 16th century by Cervantes. He wanted to write the same book. He didn't want to do it in the simple way. The simple, easy way would be to turn himself into Cervantes and to write the book that Cervantes wrote as if he were Cervantes. But no, he wants to write the same book, exactly the same book, in the same words, based on his own experience. That's Pierre Menard. And then Borges gives us a little passage, a short passage in which Pierre Menard in the 20th century produces exactly, verbatim, a passage that exists in the Cervantes text. And then Borges says, the trouble is, he says, is that same passage, those same words in the 20th century, they don't mean what they meant in the 16th century. They mean something entirely different. That's the Borges principle. And it applies to Poonam, who was one of the great examples of this principle. Okay, so I'm going to try to give you, it doesn't help very much to give a theoretical discussion. Let's look at some verses. I picked a passage from the Udyana Pravesham, Sundarakanda. I hope you can hear me. I don't know, it's noisy here. Yeah, I think so. Okay, you can hear me. Okay. So at the very beginning, the opening of the Udyana Pravesham, Ravana, he has Sita captive. She's in the Ashoka Vanika. But he doesn't know, and he desires her. It's even possible that he loves her in some Rakshasa-like way. And at the beginning of the Udyana Pravesham, Poonam gives us some insight into what is going on in Ravana's mind. So he begins, here's a verse, this is a Poonam verse, a Manipravalam verse. Yeah. So it goes like this. Lankadishan tadanim alaparichunirupich kandaudharatrao Shringara kopu vaipich inya janakaja sannidhao chenna shankam sangam cherkunna nana vidha maduravacho vaibhavar ashvasipich angi kaltavyamine punar iti sudhridam kalpayam asagudam. This is Poonam. He's talking about what is going on inside Ravana's mind. He says, the Lanka king was thinking hard, his mind flitting through many modes. Midnight, fanning the flames of his desire, decisive, he headed towards Sita. He secretly made up his mind. First, I will comfort her with fancy words conducive to connecting, and then this very day, she must be made to agree, angi kartavyam. Or else, the end of the verse, if you look at the verse, there's that punar for the iti. Punar, it's kind of dangling there. Punar, as if he hasn't finished the thought. And what we're seeing, Ravana, he's in a kind of agony of doubt, self-doubt. What is he supposed to do? He wants this woman. He doesn't know how to talk to her. He thinks maybe he can talk her into giving herself to him, but he's not sure. And anyway, he's unstable and crazy with desire. Actually, what is a lovelorn Rakshasa supposed to be? Something like that. Now we get a quotation. That verse was Poonam, pure Poonam. Now we have a quotation, and it's taken from a beautiful play, the Bala Ramayanam of Rajashekara. Same situation. So the second verse of the fifth act of the Bala Ramayana, which is now in the Poonam text, it goes like this. Asmad Vikrama Cheshtitani Nikila Trailokya Hela Jaya Prahvi Bhuta Surasurani Bahusho Bhumes Suta Shrinvati Patyau Dvesha Kashayitena Manasa Snigdha Mayistasyati Strinam Prema Yaruttarottara Guna Gramaspraha Chanchalam. Beautiful Sanskrit. But the content is a little bit unnerving. So this is Ravana, and he's speaking to a messenger who's called Maya. he's sending this messenger to Rama. And the messenger is supposed to convince Rama that Ravana has a prior claim on Sita because he broke the bow first, he thinks. That's what he thinks. Now, the messenger, Maya, he knows that Ravana is out of his mind. Mati viparyasa. He's delusional. Notice the end of this poem. What does he say? He says, I'll talk to her about all the countries in the world that I conquered in my Digvijaya. I'll tell her I lifted the Mount Kailasa. I'll do all of these things, and she'll come to hate her husband, and she'll come to me because women's hearts are fickle. So I'm sorry, this is a misogynist verse, and that final line is what we would call in our Tantranyasa. Tantranyasa means it's a general statement based on a particular, very specific situation. In our Tantranyasa, Srinam prema yarutarotala guna grama spraha chanchalam. Because, you see, that act of quotation, putting a verse from somewhere else into your own text, it has certain necessary features. They're always there. I could say, one way to say it is that it adds a kind of reflexive or metapoetic distance to the whole context. Sometimes it's ironic, could be skeptical. Not only metapoetic, it's also a kind of, dissonance. What in Carnatic music is called the vivaditva. There's a kind of vivaditva that's built into this kind of statement. You have that metapoetic statement in every quoted verse in Punam. And not only that, as soon as you begin to quote a verse like this, the entire context in which that original verse was said comes along. It's like dragged into the context of the new verse. So for example, in the Rajashekara text, the next verse is the following. I think you don't have it here. Yeah, no, there it is. Sorry, yeah. So we have it only in Sanskrit. Punam doesn't bring it. He doesn't even quote it. But if you know the Rajashekara text, you know this verse. The next thing is, this is still part of Maya's lines. It's a striking verse. He says, Sukhinaha parasaukyena paradukhkena dukhkitaha jayante kavayaha kavye nayatantricha mantrinaha. That means rejoicing in another's joy, grieving for another's grief. That is how poets make poetry and how ministers make politics. Well, I don't know if you think that's true. I mean, we can easily accept it for the poets. Poets are supposed to have empathy. They have a kind of emotional resonance, an empathic understanding of what is happening in somebody else's mind, including their own character's mind. Whether mantrina, whether ministers or advisors to the king have it, that's an interesting question. But here, Rajashekara gives us a verse with a strong political overtone, as if empathy was shared by poets and ministers. And this is part of what Maya and another minister, Malyavan, are feeling as they see Ravana becoming more and more crazy. And that kind of empathy, by the way, is also something that is supposed to apply to the alankarikas, the poeticians. They also sometimes have that gift. The thing is that once you know the original context, that verse is also going to be in your mind. It's a kind of silent, implied presence. That's reflexivity of a higher order. It's not just the reflexivity or the metapoiesis of taking a verse and putting it into your own text. Here's a verse which is reflecting upon the business of poetry. So it's a double kind of reflexive metapoetic statement. That means that a citation like this is never innocent. There's a complexity built into it. And not only that, there's an element of the self-image of the poet in that little verse. Because in Act 5 of the Rajashekara play, I don't know if you know the play, most of it is about a mechanical image of Sita made mostly out of wood. Yantra Janaki, it's called. There's a mechanical image of Sita, which the minister, trying to persuade Ravana to forget about the real Sita, has made. And that Yantra Janaki has been made by a carpenter, and there's a Sharika bird in its mouth. And that Sharika bird speaks. And it says all kinds of things that are meant to discourage Ravana from wanting Sita. So just think about that. If you know the play, suddenly you're given in this verse, in fact, the whole of the fifth act, it has that element of, let's call it ventriloquism, as if the poet was a ventriloquist and has used his ventriloquy in order to say something of interest to the audience, to the readers, to us. I'll give you another example. A little further on in the Punam text, the same passage, he gives us a famous verse. This verse is taken from Mamarta's Kavya Prakasha, one of the great works of the Alankara Shastra. It's a very well-known book, known verse. And now, suddenly, Punam, by using this verse, is telling us something about Ravana's state of mind. So here's the verse. Maybe some of you, probably many of you will know this verse. Kapale marjara paya iti karan ledhi shashinas taruchidra protan visimiti kari sankalayati ratante talpastan harati vanitapi anshukamiti prabha matash chandro jagadidamaho viplavayati. So it goes like this. A cat, do we have it? Can you raise it so they can see the English too, maybe? Yeah. A cat thinks it's milk and licks the bowl. An elephant thinks it's seeing lotus fibers and reaches for them under the trees. A woman, fresh from lovemaking, sees it on the bed and puts it on like a nightgown. What is that it that the elephant sees and the cat sees and the woman sees? It's the moon. The moon, mad with light, maddens the world. And this is a figure. This is the Alankara, which is called Brantimat. Brantimat. Brantimat means that somebody is looking at somebody or something else and seeing that somebody else make a cognitive mistake. The person who's watching knows it's a mistake. Could be the poet. Here it's the poet speaking. The poet says, look at this cat. It sees the moonlight and it thinks it's a bowl of milk and is licking up the moonlight as if it were milk. Or the elephant, or the woman. That's Brantima. That cognitive error is built into the figure. Actually, there's a lot of Brantimat verses in context of describing night and moonlight. Moonlight is the kind of thing that makes the mind confused. Maddens the mind, like it maddens the whole world. But this isn't an ordinary moonlight scene. We are getting it in the Udyana Pravesha. This is the scene in which Ravana is about to go to speak to Sita under the Ashoka tree, and it's going to lead to his death because of his cognitive error, because he's crazy, because he's Branta, he's a Brantan. So you could say it's a kind of aberration. He's in this mental aberration, but I don't know. Maybe it's not exactly an aberration. Ravana's in love. Death means very little to him compared to the power of his desire, and he can't resolve that dilemma. But here's the kind of lyrical, brilliant quality that we have in the first three images of the cat, the elephant, and the young woman. Look at how it acquires in this context a sinister aspect, maybe lethal aspect, in keeping with the Ramayana plot. And then, that's not enough, because if we follow the rule of interpretation that I mentioned earlier, listening to Poonam's replay of Mamata, we might begin to wonder if we, the readers or the listeners, are not affected by some kind of Bhranti of our own. Maybe that's the job of the poet, to create a kind of Bhrantimat illusion, in which he weaves together some necessary fiction and some emergent emotional truth. And then it turns out, if that's true, that we have a lot in common with Ravana. We might even feel empathy for him, like a poet is supposed to feel. We share that Bhranti on a deeper level. Actually, those Rajashekara verses, once they've been put into the Poonam text, they have a greater depth than they had before. So I'm just going to, how do we do? I'm doing on time. I want to read two more verses. Okay? Yeah? Okay, two more verses. Before we do that, let me sum up what I've just said about the insertion of these quoted, cited verses in Poonam. There are four elements that are always there, necessarily there. First, these verses expand and amplify the context, and they produce a kind of depth simply by virtue of the quotation itself. And that depth usually has an element of disjunction, vivaditvam, built into it. Secondly, these verses, they're reflexive by nature and metapoetic. They talk about what the poet is doing. It's a poet talking and showing us about his own art. Third, each such verse carries with it parts of the context in which it was originally embedded, in the original work. You know, not everybody in the audience has to know that context. They may not know it, but some people may know it, because there will be educated listeners and readers who are capable of carrying the overtones of that original context. That's enough. And then fourth, and this is an important thing, I don't know if this will sound odd to you, but the thing is that the reinsertion or the reapplication of such a verse, once you see it in the new context, it changes the original. So much so that you're never able to read that original again without thinking of this new context. Again, there was a rule that Borges, that same Borges, a simple rule that he formulated as follows. He was talking about translation. He says, the original is not faithful to its translation. Think about it for a minute. The original is not truthful to its translation. What does that mean? That means that the translation, or in this case, the citation, the quotation, transforms the original, changes it. So much so that you can no longer read the original without it. Those four elements are inevitably there in every quoted verse. Okay, I'm going to read two more verses. I'm hesitating because there are two verses from the Ravanolbhavam I could read, and there are two verses from a little later in the text that I would just as nice. But we'll go for the Ravanolbhavam verses because they're probably well known to you. And they follow the line of thought that I've been trying to pursue so far. So we're in the Balakandam, the Ravanolbhavam. And, you know, Ravana is doing tapasya, in order to force Brahma to give him his various desires. And we have an incredibly graphic description of what that involves that is pure punam. Punam in the sense that this is a Mani Pravalam verse. Because, Ravana, he's standing amidst these fires, there's a big fire, and he has 10 heads, and he's cutting them off one by one. That's the tapasya. One by one, he's cutting them off. Punam gives us an amazing verse in which you can actually hear the sound of the heads being cut off, Here's the verse. Do we have it? Should be one above that. Yeah, Praudatma. Praudatma kantavatim trutitagana sira baddham askandamulam pade cercumbidao ismeyam arahidu takshariye sakshi ullu vadilam mandahasam nuti banitigal tedil aho gadgadatam Kodya lachili polum vadana dashakam ekaikamasid prasannam. You know this verse? Some of you must know this verse. What? Did I make? Oh, sorry, this is a typo. Yeah, gadgadatvam, of course. Yeah. It's my Tamil habits. I can't help it. I'm sorry. It's when people who work in Tamil, you make those kinds of mistakes sometimes. I'm sorry. Gadgadatvam. So he was proud as he hacked his necks from the shoulder, all veins, nerves, and muscles. There was a strange beauty about it. That's an amazing line, no? And this is Punam. There was a strange beauty. Arahidu. It's beautiful what was happening. Yeah. There is a strange beauty in it, and Lord Shiva was the only witness. Shiva is the addressee of this. Every one of those heads kept on smiling. None of them stuttered as they sang God's praises. Not a single eyebrow twitched. They were happy, one by one. Well, that's Punam. It's an amazing verse. I think it's an amazing verse. He's imagined a situation of very extreme self-sacrifice. And even though it's a kind of rough verse in the early part of it, there's a sort of melodic repetition of the negative verbs in the third and fourth padas. Vadi lamandahasam, then nuti banitigal tedil, aho gadgadatvam, and kodil achili polam. There's a music to it. And in fact, Punam is very melodic. So you could say, something amazing is happening. It's nothing very bad or painful to Ravana, apparently. And in that case, it's a true virodha, no abhasa at all. There's no, seeming semblance. It's a true virodha. These sawed-off heads go on smiling. But then there's a beautiful verse. And this is a verse which comes from Murari, from the Anargha Raghava in the sixth act. Murari is one of my favorite Sanskrit poets. So I was happy to see this verse. Let's read it. This will be the last one I'll read today. Sweshu kritya huteshu murdhasu javad anthas sputitva bahir vyakirne shalikeshu divya lipibhir drishtvapi ramayanam chittena skalitena yastadadikam Brahmanam aprinayad viro nairta pungavaha katamasau vitin giram gahate. This is Murari. And now it's become Punam. Those heads he cut off kept exploding from within the fire. And on the scattered foreheads, he could see the whole Ramayana in a godly script. The Talavrata, Talayir. Right? It didn't unnerve him in the least. He went on worshiping the god as if nothing had happened. Can words depict this gruesome hero? There's a lot of things one could say about this Murari verse. I mean, first of all, you'll notice that the future pre-exists. It pre-exists its tangible enactment. Well, maybe that's not so surprising because all of us who read Punam or Murari or the Bhoja Prabandham. We know the story, and we know what's going to happen. But now, even Ravana knows it. Each one of those 10 heads has a whole Ramayana written, lipi, right? He can read what is going to happen to him in his life. And he seems to have time to read it, which means that he knows that in the end Rama is going to kill him and cut off all of those heads, right? So that's a kind of, I don't know, I call this a metapoiesis with a punch, because it's a very sensitive moment in the character's biography. But suddenly, just notice that there's a much deeper and wider perceptual and cognitive insight that binds the anti-hero, the audience, and the creative poet together in a new intimacy. You know what? Ravana is reading the Ramayana, and so are we. We're just like him. We're readers. And here's a verse about reading. Actually, it's reading in the technical sense because he uses the word lipi, something's written, but you could also say listening. And actually something like that, something which is reflexive or metapoetic in that fashion, happens regularly as we read and reread the Punam text. So I'll take just one more minute to sum up in a word or two. First of all, you'll notice that by including all of these cited verses, Punam has given us a kind of orchestral chorus of voices that blend and amplify and harmonize. They're also disjunctive and often ironic or pungent. So that the author, in a way, is more like an orchestral conductor who slips into the musical score with his own strong music. Or you could say he's a bit more like a Vyasa than like a Valmiki or a Kalidasa. But in any case, those verses, the quoted verses, they're necessary and integral to the poetic vision of this great poet. And that means that his hyper-Ramayana, or you could say meta-Ramayana, generates in its audiences a particular, in fact, singular aesthetic experience, which is also, by the way, intensified by the division of the text into discrete novella-like segments or chapters meant for continuous performance. You know, there are huge sections of the Ramayana that don't exist in Punam. So it's a kind of anthology held together by the constant integrative role of the new Manipravalam Malayalam poems, which usually surprise us. And probably the audience was equally diverse in status, education, and cultural roles. And if we had more time, we might want to say more about these gaps and the silences that we find in Punam's text. And maybe the audience should include, as my student Sivan Goran has suggested, she's writing a new book about Manipravalam Champu texts. Maybe the audience should include the lush landscapes of Kerala itself. It's as if, she says, this is Sivan Goran saying, it is as if the entire Kerala landscape, a green paradise, had made up its mind to drive Rama insane. Rama insane, because that comes from a particular moment in the Aranyakanda. Or maybe that Kerala landscape, this green paradise, is meant to overwhelm us, the readers and the listeners. I'll leave you with that thought tonight. Thank you.